So I kept hearing rumblings about this game called No Rest for the Wicked, and honestly I wasn't very excited for it just because I thought that was kind of a goofy and cliche sounding title, but this is a classic example of not judging a book, or I guess a game by its cover or title actually now that I think about it, because after I looked into it a little bit more deeply, this seemed like exactly the type of game that I would enjoy. So I went ahead and put out a community poll on the community section to see what you guys thought of it, and a lot of you were also kind of mixed on it, which is completely in line with what the reviews are for this game on Steam right now. However, I just couldn't help myself and I went ahead and took the leap, even though the early access price was about $35, which seemed like a bit of a gamble, but ultimately whenever I saw the gameplay for it and saw that it was a top-down, oil painterly sort of looking game with a Soulsian type of combat, I was like, this is exactly the kind of game that I would enjoy. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is what my experience has been like so far with No Rest for the Wicked, some of the things that I thought they could have improved on, and ultimately how it performs on the Steam Deck as well. So all that being said, let's just go ahead and kick this off by talking about what you can expect from No Rest for the Wicked. No Rest for the Wicked is set in the year 841, where you'll be taking on the role of a holy warrior who's been tasked with investigating the island of Sakra, specifically to check on a plague called the Pestilence. You'll start by crafting your character for the adventure, and I have to say the proportions are pretty wild. Also, I really like the character creator. It's not as staggeringly deep as something like Dragon's Dogma 2, but it's not lacking necessarily either. It gives you a couple of dozen adjustments you can make, which for me is just about perfect since I hate getting jammed up on new character creation when I just want to get into the story and get things moving. After things get rolling, you'll find a lot of familiar mechanics as its tutorial guides you through the basics of movement, combat, and surprisingly cooking, along with just interacting with its various systems. And while a lot of it should be easy to pick up if you're an ARPG veteran, there were some nice twists on the formula I found that made it feel pretty fresh. For starters, even though there is a penalty if you fall in battle, it's a fairly innocuous one where, rather than losing all of the currency you'd use to level up or having to worry about retrieving your body to get said currency back, you'll just lose some durability on your gear. Granted, I'm sure this could get somewhat annoying over time, but so far it's been a welcome change from what's become pretty standard fare for Souls-likes. And ultimately it made me excited to engage in combat rather than just shying away from it because I didn't want to risk losing any major character progress. Something else I'm still struggling to wrap my head around in a good way is just how complex these environments are. It's not uncommon for Souls-likes to have an intricate level structure that eventually folds back in on itself through some unlockable shortcut, but No Rest for the Wicked really has some neat navigational tricks up its sleeve. For example, most of the time when you're playing a top-down isometric game, the barriers of its traversable areas feel rigid and well-defined, meaning you can walk on the flat parts, but if you're at the edge of an expanse next to a cliff or some barrier separating you from another part of the level, you have to find a way to get around. But here, almost everything you see can be accessed, which left me constantly second-guessing what was on screen and whether or not I could reach a certain area in front of me, and more often than not, yes, you can totally reach that area that looks to be off-limits. And this is mostly thanks to your character's ability to climb anything that looks waist-high or as if it should be able to be climbed. You typically can climb it. And in that way, I always felt like my curiosity was being rewarded. Sometimes with something small like cooking ingredients, but sometimes with something way better like a legitimately helpful armor upgrade as I move from tattered rags to beefier protection. Of course, if you want a broader view of the area you're traversing, you can always refer to the map, which is very well implemented and carries its own unique twist. While resting at Whispers, which is their version of bonfires or lanterns, won't respawn enemies, over time Fog of War will start to descend on parts of the map that you've already visited. It won't totally obscure it, but what it means is that new enemies or loot might appear in areas that have faded a bit from your memory as time passes on. I think this could be a nightmare for completionists, but as a filthy casual it made revisiting prior areas more exciting since I never was sure what I might find, even when I had to backtrack because I got turned around. Also, one more quick thing that I really appreciated is that it passed the stamina drain at run test. My position has always been that if you're in a game that utilizes stamina management, then it should only drain in combat scenarios. Mostly because outside of combat scenarios, you're just trying to get to where you're going, and getting tuckered out from jogging really drags down the pacing. I tolerate this in Helldivers 2 because it's incredibly good, and the tension of being chased down by hordes of bots or bugs gets ratcheted up with this extra layer of inconvenience, but by and large, if I'm just trying to get to my next objective, don't punish me for wanting to get there quickly. And No Rest for the Wicked doesn't. However, it does punish you in other ways, which brings me to the next thing I really loved, and that is that things behave the way you would expect them to, more or less. Which is to say, it's a really immersive experience. For instance, one dumb thing I always like to try in games like this is to just walk into a fire and see if it burns me. I figure it's better to learn something like this on your own terms than to accidentally run through some blaze while you're in the heat of battle. Another pleasant surprise was figuring out how accurate the physics were and trying to sort out how fall damage works. In this section in particular, I jumped across this gap here and started finding this lone beefy boy guarding a chest on a particularly short ledge, and I figured out real quick this was either going to teach me that fall damage is a thing, either from me falling off or the other guy falling off, and it felt great just being able to sort of tap him off the ledge and into oblivion and ending the combat encounter in this way. No, it wasn't as good as Sekiro's Armored Warrior fight or anything like that, but it was still pretty cool. Aside from just wondering if my hero would pass the stamina, fall damage, and fire tests, there are other things that I also look for when I'm getting a feel for a game like this, and one of those is just talking to every NPC that I find just to see what happens. And I guess my sort of litmus test for NPC interactivity is that at the low end you would have NPCs who don't talk at all and really just serve as, kind of set dressing, I guess. But then at the high end of that scale, you would have NPCs that either provide good interactivity related to quests or the game's mechanics, or enrich the narrative with sharply written dialogue, or ideally both. And I was happy to see that just about every person I could talk to in No Rest for the Wicked had something interesting to say.
It wasn't long before the black rot set in. Lost my arm to no more than a pinprick. Would you believe that? And now I'm here. They don't call me the Butcher no more. They don't call me nothing.
And a lot of the time they would provide 2 to 3 varied responses per conversation. Cabin Boy Wart was a particular favorite of mine for reasons that I won't spoil here. But hey, you can't talk about immersion without getting into the visuals a bit, and man, this game is just super pretty. Definitely taxing on a technical level, but certainly a looker. I think the best way that I can describe the presentation is it's sort of like if Tim Burton was tasked with making a Diablo Sea of Thieves edition. Just about every frame I've seen in the cutscene so far is completely stunning in that oil painting style. Like, even watching the footage back while I was editing this video, I just kept scrubbing back to see those early scenes play out because they are completely gorgeous.
The great pestilence has returned, Lord Bowers.
Yes, I have heard the rumors.
They're not rumors. Even now, it ravages the island of Sakra just off our own shores, turning their men and women into unspeakable things.
Also, after watching, I think it was Digital Foundry's video breaking down some of the technical details, apparently they were able to lend more scale to the restrictive top-down view by curving the world's horizon in a way that's not too dissimilar to Animal Crossing. I was so skeptical going in that you could really have that much, or I guess that engaging of an exploration experience from this perspective, but nope, it all works together brilliantly and will make you want to pore over every nook and cranny hunting for chests, materials to gather, or new recipes. And the world is just jam-packed full of particle effects and visual flourishes that really give the whole thing a kind of storybook quality, which I guess isn't surprising from the developers of Ori after all. And I really appreciate this dash of lightness in the environment because as much as I love games like Bloodborne or Demon's Soul or Sekiro, those games usually have a pretty heavy aesthetic without a lot of frivolity, so having an intricate ARPG experience that's set against a fairly colorful backdrop is really exciting and kind of a refreshing change of pace, honestly. And we should probably talk about that a little bit because you can have all of the immersive design decisions and pretty graphics in the world, but it won't matter if what you do in that world is boring, and this game is anything but boring. In fact, it's downright thrilling a lot of the time, and in combat, it's extremely well balanced for early access. Not perfect, but we'll get to that in a little bit. For now, just know that the moment-to-moment action feels incredible. It's weighty, and you immediately get the sense that every move needs to be deliberate, because swinging wildly and depleting all of your stamina leaves you vulnerable. If you have no stamina, you can't block or attack, so every encounter with an enemy feels like a grim sort of dance. And in turn, every foe you drop feels like an earned victory, even when they're scrubs, and actually especially when they're scrubs, because they can group up quick and outmaneuvering 2 or 3 enemies at once is taxing but rewarding. Also, each weapon feels distinct from the last. Initially you'll get some sword and board time in, but before too long you'll find that moving on to something like daggers like I did feels just as good, but wildly different. Between the two, I favored the roguish speed of fast rolling and getting in and out quickly with daggers rather than tanking hits or parrying with a shield, although I will say that parrying feels super satisfying with this echoing gong that rings out that really drives the point home whenever you successfully land one. I also got a little bit of time in with a claymore as well, and while I appreciate the devastating damage that it can dish out, I'm not quite sure it suits my playstyle, but still, it's interesting to see these different weapons at work and how each one feels so distinct from the last. Also, I should point out that just like Souls games, there are different speeds at which you can roll and dodge out of the way, but even fat rolling when you're carrying too much gear feels new and improved, considering if you go for the heavy roll route, you get access to a shoulder rush to compensate for your lack of speed. It's pretty cool that they've managed to take what is historically something you would want to avoid in a Souls game and actually made it something that has a bit of a bonus associated with it. And I would say that as long as they can keep a steady stream of interesting bad guys to fight with these abilities that force you to get creative, I could see the combat in this being extremely entertaining long term. And while it lifts a lot of its ideas straight from Dark Souls or Bloodborne, it never comes off as anything less than respectful original homage. Yes, it's familiar, but there's enough variation to keep it engaging. And I think that's the last thing that really spoke to me most in my time with No Rest for the Wicked, that it wears its influences on its sleeve and takes inspiration from some really smart places. You can feel Zelda in its DNA as soon as you smash your first barrels looking for trinkets, or start seeing that stamina bar pop up while you're climbing something. It's also entirely likely that at least some of the visual design decisions here drew inspiration from Sea of Thieves. I'm not saying that No Rest for the Wicked is bereft of any original ideas or anything, I'm just saying it's really refreshing to see a developer not only include nods to pieces of their favorite games, but even be bold enough to try and improve some of those same mechanics. Even their approach to basic things like how the map works is fascinating in ways that legitimately made me stop playing for a second to think about how they arrived at those design decisions. Although while we're talking about pauses, I do have some grievances with No Rest for the Wicked, and most notably is probably its performance. Now if you're playing on a beefy desktop rig, you should be able to run the game at a mostly stable 60 FPS if you're playing at 1080 or 1440, but on the Steam Deck you should temper your expectations because it's going to be closer to 30 FPS using the performance mode preset. Now there might be some combination of settings that you can fine-tune to bump this up a little bit, but again, as an early access title, it's just not going to have everything optimized like a full-blown release would just yet. Outside of the so-so Steam Deck performance, there were a couple of other annoying little things. One is that there's no pause button, which I know there are games, and even Souls games, that do this as a conscious design choice to keep the tension high, but given that Moon has been so forgiving about things like how much of a setback death actually is, I'm not sure why they wouldn't have included a pause feature here. I mean, I guess if they were trying to go just like balls to the wall with the difficulty or something, then it would maybe make sense not to include a pause feature, but yeah, this is something I really hope they add in a future update. Also, while the lock-on for combat generally worked great, there were a couple of instances where I lost my lock-on while trying to deal with an enemy on some stairs. I'm not sure if that's a bug or what, but it was infrequent enough that I wasn't too concerned about it, just an observation in case anyone experienced similar issues while fighting somebody on an incline. And finally, once or twice I did fall through the map in trying to find my way around a particularly tricky area. And speaking of fall damage, I really hope they tweak how much you take, because man, I died way too much from fall damage than anything else in the game so far. But hey, this is an early access game, and these are exactly the sort of pain points or rough edges I expect to be sanded down as we race towards a proper release. Overall, I have to say I'm completely entranced by No Rest for the Wicked. I'm hoping they optimize it further for the deck as they get near a full release date, but as it stands, if you have a dedicated gaming rig or don't mind the occasional struggle towards 30 FPS to play it on the deck, I'd say it's worth it if you like games that are tough. If you're looking for a top-down experience where you decimate waves and waves of enemies and brush off any of their retaliations with ease, then this probably isn't going to be the game for you. But if you like a stiff but fair challenge and have cut your teeth on any number of games from FromSoft's catalog, you'll definitely want to keep an eye on this one at the very least, assuming you haven't taken the leap already. And speaking of which, what about you? Did you already take the leap on No Rest for the Wicked? If not, was there some reason for it? Were you also, like me, a little bit hesitant based on what you'd seen so far? If so, I think that would be completely understandable given the mixed reviews, but yeah, if you want to let me know your thoughts in the comments below, I would love to hear them. As far as what's coming down the pike for next week, I will have another video out on emulation, talking about some games that I enjoy emulating on the Steam Deck right now, and then also April pickups, I think, is coming after that. So, as always, thank you so much for your time and supporting me here on the channel. It means a ton to me. Take care, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.